Hi everyone. One of the people I most respect in the world, one of my favorite people, and I thank God I've known him since I was a kid. We went to the Hebrew Academy here in Miami together, and then reconnected at Oxford University, is Israel's former ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer. It's hard for me to even fully express how much I love and respect Ron and everything he's done for Israel. Easily Israel's most successful ambassador, most accomplished, thank God. The Abraham Accords, he was one of the chief negotiators, let alone his defenses of Israel, with the eloquence that he brought to bear in every interview he did on national American television and international TV, through difficult years and different administrations. Ambassador Ron Dermer.
Good to be with you, Shmuley. Good to be with you on this. We're coming close to the eve of Passover, another few days.
People, yeah. So, look, people, they look up to you. You led a lot of things.
Well, you look up to me because I'm 6'1" and you're shorter.
That's true.
I don't know if other people look up to me, but
I look up
my
to you.
eldest son looks down on me because he's 6'5". But
Well, this stature-wise, I also look up to you. What is the state of the Jewish people as we come to Passover this year? Are you worried? Are you inspired? Are you optimistic? Are you concerned?
I'm very optimistic because you have to have a little historical perspective, and when you have that historical perspective, you think to yourself that no matter what problems we're facing now, we are facing issues. We have a terror wave that's happened over in Israel for the last couple of weeks, but you think to yourself, our grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents, going back 100 generations, would have given anything to trade their problems with ours. So when you have that understanding, you realize that we are a uniquely blessed generation to live at a time when there's a sovereign Jewish state, and also that the Jews in many places, certainly in the United States, live in freedom, and that's something that I think we should be very thankful for. The generation that left Egypt, was dealing with slavery for a couple of centuries, and obviously this tremendous change that happened in the condition of the Jewish people. But you probably have to go from Passover, that period, some 3,300 years ago, to the times we're living in now, to see people that had such a dramatic reversal in the condition of the Jews. You had the Holocaust, and then immediately in the wake of the Holocaust, you have the birth of Israel. So that is a fairly dramatic change, and I think it probably ancient Egypt is the last time that you had such a great change from going to the depths of despair to this sort of pinnacle of hope. And we should never lose sight of that.
That's an incredible Dvar Torah, actually, that I didn't think about that, this dramatic change of slavery to liberation. But even back then, the Jews didn't have their own army. God fought for them, and that's what Moshe even says to them, Hashem yilachem lachem, God will fight
Well,
for
except
you.
for one thing, he didn't fight for them with Amalek, which I always thought was an interesting thing.
Right.
So all of a sudden you destroy the Egyptian army, it drowns in the sea, the 10 plagues and everything that happened before that. But when it comes to Amalek, that happens right after, which is the fight against pure evil, that Hashem does not fight for the Jewish people. The Jewish people have to fight for themselves. And I think it's a very fascinating point, because the Jews are supposed to be there to acknowledge the Creator in the world, to be this connection sort of between heaven and earth, and to sanctify the world, something you spoke about all the time at Oxford. And Amalek is sort of the antithesis of that. They're the denial of the of the sacred in the world. And that is not a battle that Hashem, that God can fight for us. That's a battle that we have to fight for himself. Confronting evil is not for Hashem to do, it's for us to do.
You should have been a rabbi.
Well, I learned from one of the best.
That is a fascinating concept. The world doesn't fight evil enough. I know that you're going to be speaking about this on national TV, but you were the great warrior of the Jewish people during the first JCPOA, the first Iran deal, 2015. Now it's coming back, and that's part of the evil we have to fight. A government like that is. Are you surprised that we've learned nothing from?
No, I'm not surprised. You have to ask yourself, why is it that why did appeasement happen in the 1930s? Were these people who, the Chamberlains and others, were they immoral people? Were they foolish people? And I don't think they were immoral or foolish. I just think that it all comes down to World War I, where 16 million people died, and it was the dumbest war in human history, and an entire generation was elected to avoid confrontation at all costs. That's what their charge was. And they fulfilled their commitment that they made to the people. We're going to avoid wars. But of course, when you take that approach that the worst possible outcome is to have a conflict, you end up actually fighting a much worse conflict. So in the 1930s, as all the information was coming in from Berlin, and you can see the cables today, and the historians can study it, and it all seems so clear in hindsight. It's not that people didn't see it or didn't hear it. They didn't want to see, they didn't want to hear it, because they didn't want to deal with the consequences of recognizing that here was this guy, Hitler, who was trying to build up Nazi Germany and was going to do all these horrific things. They just would rather put their heads in the sand and deny it. And I think that you have people today, after Afghanistan and after Iraq, that they just prefer not to see and not to hear, and to avoid a confrontation at all costs. And of course, what happened with World War I, where 16 million people were killed, because of the policies of appeasement, we ended up in a second World War where 60 million people were killed, including 1/3 of our people, the Jewish people. And so the danger is, after Iraq and Afghanistan, which had thousands, not millions, thousands of people, obviously a huge cost, and certainly each individual there and the family of the loved ones who were killed, it's an enormous tragedy. But in historical terms, it's much smaller, certainly by a factor of 100 compared to what you had in World War I. But the winds of appeasement are there, and now when you have this real aggressor on the horizon, you're giving them, the world, the leading powers of the world, are giving them a glide path to a nuclear arsenal, because the nuclear deal doesn't block Iran's path to the bomb, it paves it. And it's also going to remove all these sanctions if they end up consummating this deal, which will just enable Iran's aggression. And if we've learned one thing today, particularly because of what's happening with Ukraine and Russia, that when you have an aggressive power that is armed with nuclear weapons, your ability to deal with it is much more limited. We're deterred, not them. I mean, there wouldn't even be a conversation about having a no-fly zone over Ukraine if Russia didn't have nuclear weapons. Of course they would do it, but the fear of an escalation is so great. So if Iran were, God forbid, were able to develop nuclear weapons, then I think their aggression would grow by orders of magnitude, and everyone would be so concerned about doing anything. And I think it's a very, very dangerous situation that we're in, and everything has to be done to stop it. And I think one thing we should also learn from what happened in Ukraine is that no one is going to speak out to defend us if we're not willing to speak out and defend ourselves. I mean, what happened is you have this Prime Minister of Ukraine, who's Jewish, Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky. He takes a stand. That inspires his own country. It inspires people around the world to come and to rally to his defense. But no one's going to defend Ukraine if Ukraine is not willing to defend itself. And they are willing to defend themselves, not only rhetorically, but on the ground. I think that's an important lesson for all countries, including Israel, because you have to stand up and confront this. And if I have criticism of the current Israeli government, it's that they're not standing forcefully and publicly against the nuclear deal with Iran. And I think that undermines Israel's case. We should be standing up and speaking out, just like the former Prime Minister Netanyahu did in 2015 when the first nuclear deal happened. Take that stand. Are you definitely going to win? Maybe not. But at least when you take the stand, you've enabled yourself to mobilize other people, and I think over the long term, you're going to win. It's better for you to fight even a battle that you ultimately lose than to simply concede the battle and to be quiet and hope for the best.
You know, I had the unique privilege of knowing great Jewish leaders who, for me, were defined by one singular characteristic. They believed that they had a historical responsibility to protect this very vulnerable people who had experienced a genocide from any further attack. So I knew, Yitzhak Shamir, and I knew Arik Sharon, and I knew Shimon Peres, and I can go through the list of all these great Rabin, but it was getting to know Prime Minister Netanyahu for 30 years. He was always defined by that. And the truth is, Ron, that so are you. The reason why you're saying what you're saying is that in your core you feel this historic responsibility to protect your people. And God gave you this capacity to do so as the ambassador in 2015 when there was a genocidal threat to the Jewish people. And then, as we say in the Haggadah, that God says, it keeps on arising. So the threat came, you and the Prime Minister fought it. You were an army of two, essentially. You had friends, but you were an army, the two of you had to lead it. You had to lead in the United States, he had to lead it globally. Then President Trump came along and removed the threat, at least temporarily, as it were, by removing the JCPOA, and here we are again. So as someone who feels that deep-seated conviction of protecting your people, how does that make you feel?
Mean that they're doing it again?
How does it make you feel that we're back to square one? You're back to fighting this battle all over again, and you're saying to yourself, wait a second, where's the fight?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me, because for the Obama administration and now the Biden administration, and it's essentially the same people who are involved in the negotiations with Iran, this issue has almost become an article of faith. It's almost a religious issue. And the thing has become so absurd, where the desperation to make this nuclear deal with Iran, it's unfortunate. And like, we had to fight it then, and I think it should be fought now. And it is true that when we fought the deal in 2015, they ultimately signed it anyway, but that was a predicate for Trump's decision, I think, to withdraw from the deal. Without Israel taking that stand, I don't think he withdraws from the deal, and it was certainly the right thing to do.
So there was ultimately a reward. There was a positive consequence to the battle that you and the Prime Minister fought in 2015.
There were many positive consequences. It was not only that ultimately that led the United States to withdraw from the deal, it also, I think, changed Israel's relations with the Arab world.
Right.
And I think it helped eventually enable the Abraham Accords that happened. And I must confess, this was not something that I saw ahead of time. Like, to me, the battle was, we are dealing with another Munich. We are dealing with a historic appeasement of the leading powers of the world, of a regime that openly calls and actively works to destroy Israel, seeks also the destruction of our Arab neighbors, and leads chains, not just in death to Israel, but also death to America. So to me, this is a Munich, and we have to fight this, and we have a moral obligation. Certainly the Prime Minister, as the head of the one and only Jewish state, has an obligation to fight it, period. What I didn't expect is how his stand against this deal, how it was going to affect the Arab states. Because what the Arab states saw in the time, they were really in awe of the Prime Minister's decision to fight this agreement. And for them, it was sort of like Israel's declaration of independence from America, because if we are the vassal of Rome, well, let's just deal with Rome. You don't have to deal with the vassal. And all of a sudden, Israel was an independent, sovereign country, willing to speak out, even against a matter that was against the wishes and the views of the sitting president. By the way, when Zelensky came just recently, and he did a Zoom speech to all of Congress, and everybody's applauding him, he's speaking against the policy of the sitting president of the United States. President Biden was against enforcing a no-fly zone. Zelensky knew that, and yet he still went and he spoke out for the United States to change his policy. And I have great respect for it, because he's representing Ukraine. He wants to mobilize the world to help his country. That is what leaders do. And Netanyahu did that in 2015. I think he rallied a lot of people in the United States, not just on one side of the political aisle, although it is true that all Republicans oppose it, but there were also Democrats who courageously stood up against the president of their own party, because it was an easy decision for Republicans to make. It was a harder political decision for Democrats to make, but you had some 24
in the House. You had 4 Democratic senators, including prominent ones like Senator Schumer and Senator Menendez, who opposed the nuclear deal. So you had bipartisan opposition to the nuclear deal. And that was a predicate ultimately to Trump leaving the deal. Unfortunately, rather than continuing the policy of this maximum pressure campaign, which, contrary to what he said, was working, because it really started in 2019, because Trump did not even leave the deal until May 2018, and then it took another year where he was given waivers for Iran to sell oil. You really had massive economic pressures only from about mid-2019, and they were there for about a year and a half. And unfortunately, the incoming Biden administration threw a lifeline to the Iranian regime and said, you know what, if you just hold out a little bit more, help's going to be on the way, and we're going to go right back into the deal, and we're going to remove all the sanctions. And I think it's a tragic mistake. I hope they don't do this deal, but they seem hell-bent on doing everything they can in order to make this deal happen. It is not going to make Israel safer. It's not going to make our region safer. And I hope that they will reconsider. It seems like the only thing right now that is left is whether or not the Revolutionary Guard will be removed from the designated sanctions list. I mean, it would be ridiculous to do that, but that's not even the worst thing about the deal. The worst thing in the deal is that it gives them a glide path to a nuclear arsenal. That's what the deal does. And so you haven't solved the one problem you're supposed to solve, which is Iran's nuclear weapons ambition, and you're making all the other problems much worse by removing the sanctions. So it makes no sense. It didn't make sense in 2015. It doesn't make sense now. And hopefully they will reconsider, but I'm a little bit skeptical that they'll reconsider. It might be that the Iranians won't go into the deal for their own reason, because they may feel that the Biden administration is so desperate that they can squeeze more out of them, or they may feel, hey, you know what, let's not get into the deal. They're not really enforcing the sanctions now. We have the Chinese giving us a safety net, an economic safety net, so we don't have huge pressures on. And let's stay out of the deal and slowly but surely work our way up and ultimately break out to a bomb without the deal. They may make that decision as well. I think that the right policy is to shut the lights out on Iran. That's what I think the policy should be. But it's to have a credible military threat against Iran, to have crippling sanctions, and to reach out to the Iranian people, who are not our enemies, but who are a potential ally. They are an ally. They can't stay in the regime, and they seek the support of the outside world to help them, I think, get rid of this regime that is disaster for them, a disaster for a region, a disaster for the world.
We're about to end, but Ron, I am so surprised that 2015 we all fought the Iran deal. AIPAC, our organization, the Israeli government, 80% of the American people were opposed to the deal. And
I don't know about 80, but it was a majority.
22% were in favor, so something like 80 were. Although interestingly, in the Jewish community, it was 50-50. That never made sense to me, that the American people were opposed to it, but the Jewish community. But I am kind of shocked, and you're emphasizing it. Just, wow, it's so different now that everyone's thrown in the towel. Our organization was the only ones. We did a full page ad in the New York Times against the deal 3 weeks ago. Full page ad of the New York Times. And a lot of people called me and said, waste of money. People who fought the deal in 2015, it waste of money. They told me it's a done deal. They said it'll be signed. Our ad came out on Saturday. They said it'll be signed Monday. And it just shows you they were wrong, because it hasn't been signed yet. And who knows? If we fought it, maybe it wouldn't be signed.
Doesn't matter. Sometimes, you can't just fight battles that you know you're going to win. I think it was Churchill who said, nations who fight and lose rise again. But nations who surrender are finished. And to me, I don't really blame other organizations and other groups for not fighting it, because it has to begin with Israel.
Right.
First, Israel has to take a stand. Then we can come to others. It's like, with the issue with Oslo, where there's a lot of criticism of the Clinton administration. Well, that's what the Israeli government at the time was pushing. It wasn't actually the U.S. administration. It was the Israeli government, or the disengagement with the Bush administration. That was Israel's government. So first, let Israel take the stand. Then we can come and we can say, why are you not standing with Israel? But first, Israel has to take the stand. And it's a mistake to think that Israel is not a country that can lead from behind. And I think this is true, by the way, of Jews more broadly. I mean, on anti-Semitism and other issues, we can't act behind the scenes, have others step forward and stand up to anti-Semitism. The Jewish people have to take a stand. Israel has to take a stand. Then you can rally others to your side, people of goodwill, Jews and non-Jews who want to actually fight with you. But what people see is, wait a second, if Israel's not getting up and it's not shouting, if it's not going in Congress and it's not raising its voice there, if it's not going on television and explaining why this is a bad deal, not just put out a perfunctory tweet, but actually go and explain it, well, this can't be so bad because they're quiet. If it was such a disaster, then Israel would be doing.
Yeah.
And actually, this is a government in Israel that has forces both on the right and on the left. And if they were actually standing up against it, they would say, like, hey, this is beyond politics. It's not about Netanyahu. It's not about a government of the right in Israel. It's about all the Israeli people being opposed to it. Well, this government should cash in whatever political capital it has and make the case. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to win. But to not fight, to not make the case, this is something to me that I think is unconscionable and is a big mistake, because that's not how it works. By the way, we may lose today, but tomorrow you could have a victory. That's what happened in 2015. We didn't win in 2015, but because of that fight, it ultimately led to the change. And what you want to do is have a chance that even if the Biden administration is hell-bent on moving forward with the deal, that maybe a future administration will change it. Maybe there'll be a question mark that will hang over the deal so that investors won't jump into Iran and think, hey, this whole thing is over. No, let's put a question mark. People should understand that you invest in Iran today, you might be sanctioned tomorrow. You don't know that. And the other thing is, lay a predicate for potential action that Israel may take. Because everyone's saying, look, we're not going to abide by this deal. It's not going to bind us. We may actually have to take action. Well, the Israeli government should explain today why we may have to take action tomorrow, so that no one's going to come with us. Why all of a sudden, on a clear blue day, did you take action against Iran? We had no idea that you were going to do this. Well, we may be right. Because if Israel is not explaining it, Israel has to be very clear and very vocal and opposed to it. And I think that position will be respected. They may not agree with it. They may go ahead with the deal anyway. But I think over the long term, that is actually in Israel's interest and will only strengthen the alliance that we have with the United States as well. People will respect that decision. And then we can go to others and say, you know what, we've spoken up. We ask you to stand with us on this important issue. But there's no reason to be quiet about this. And I hope my own government will change its posture, and I hope the Biden administration will come to its senses, because it is a huge mistake to go ahead with this deal that is, as I said, is dangerous, terribly dangerous for Israel, dangerous for the region, dangerous for the Arab neighbors. They're like, but what does Israel and the Arabs know? We just live in the region, right? The British, the French, the Germans, the Americans, they know what's better for us, right? They're going to save Israel and the Arab states from itself. Israel and the Arabs both understand that this is a disaster. America should listen to its friends and allies in the region, should walk away from this very bad deal, strengthen the pressure against Iran, hold that line, put a credible military threat, and reach out to the Iranian people. That's the alternative.
I want to do one final thing.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with us. You are a very humble man, like as am I. You know, you're genuinely humble. Ron, you were the principal negotiator for Israel in the Abraham Accords, because it was during COVID. There was no travel. And I was in Dubai. I've seen the miracle of the Abraham Accords. But you're so close to Prime Minister Netanyahu, someone you and I love and cherish, that you never really talked about your own role. You always ascribe everything to the Prime Minister, which I respect very much. But you were the guy that negotiated.
But my ability to function was that I was seen as being very close to him and being an envoy that could speak for the Prime Minister and to the Prime Minister. And there were very few people who were even aware of the Abraham Accords when it happened. A handful. Actually, I think a total maybe of 4 people in Israel who knew about it maybe 24 hours before. And we kept it sort of under the radar screen to allow this thing to surface. And we were very fortunate that we were able to finalize it at that time because of the shifts that were happening in the region. It was actually something that we were arguing for several years, that this possibility was there to make a peace with the Arabs before you finalize a peace agreement with the Palestinians, because everyone said, you know, if you make peace with the Palestinians, you'll get peace with 22 Arab states. And I would say, well, that's great. What if the Palestinians don't want to make peace? Does that mean we have to wait? And fortunately, you had leaders in the Arab world who were actually willing to cross this Rubicon and make peace with us. And we had an administration that also put in place policies like confronting Iran being an important one, embracing Israel, not chasing after the Palestinians, leaving a door open for the Palestinians to make peace, but not giving the Palestinians a veto. They put in place policies that facilitated the surfacing of this, and I feel very blessed that was able to play a role in achieving that. But frankly, without all the other actors, it would not have happened. Netanyahu clearly had the vision of this being possible a full decade before it happened. Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of the Emirates, had the courage to actually make this decision because he goes the courage. And the Trump administration had the policies in place that really facilitated it. And we had very good partners, and we were very fortunate to be able to do it. My one regret is that we started it at the end of the administration rather than the beginning of the administration, because I think had it been started at the beginning, the Israeli-Arab conflict would be over.
Wow. I think Saudi Arabia would have joined.
Yes, if we started it at the beginning, yes. And I think Saudi Arabia could, frankly, if the U.S. would shift its policy on Iran and take a different approach to Saudi Arabia, this administration, the Biden administration, could see a surfacing of the ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia and also achieve this historic agreement. Now, the end of the Israeli-Arab conflict doesn't mean the end of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, doesn't mean the end of the Israeli-Iran conflict, but you have a conflict for a century between Israel and the Arab states. We went from a peace with Egypt and Jordan to now adding Bahrain, the Emirates, Sudan, and Morocco. I think Saudi Arabia, once that peace is in place, you're then on the other side of the mountain when it comes to the Israeli-Arab conflict. And the hope would be that peace and a broader peace between Israel and the Arab world could then enable more moderate elements among the Palestinians to emerge, because the radical ones will be undermined, because they won't have this idea that the Arab world and the Muslim world will all of a sudden, the cavalry will come in and help them destroy Israel. Well, if they're in peace with Israel, these Arab states and other Muslim countries as well, then maybe that will empower those forces within Palestinian society that would like to reach some sort of a compromise and some sort of historic peace.
I have to disagree with you. I think what you and the Prime Minister achieved is much bigger than the peace with Jordan and the Camp David Accords, because that was a very cold peace. There was never real interaction between the populations. But I was in the UAE, I was in Dubai, I was in Abu Dhabi, and I just couldn't believe it's totally unlike.
It's different, but it's not.
There's real appreciation.
Right, but that's
Israelis
because
are traveling there. I walked around with a yarmulke. Can I walk around with a yarmulke and sit this in Amman? I'm not going to really attempt it, although I've been to Jordan. In Cairo, I'm definitely not going to chance it. But in Dubai, you were our student president at Oxford. One of our other student leaders, Ross Creel, built a Jewish community there. He runs a shul in a hotel that's pretty like this one, and it's the respect that's shown to the Jewish community is incredible. I felt nothing but acceptance as I walked through the Yom consensus everywhere. So what you guys achieved with the Abraham Accords, it's a different kind of peace.
I agree with you. Better a cold peace than a hot war, but it's a cold peace, and it's a cold peace because there are forces within Egypt and Jordan, political forces, economic forces, cultural forces, that militate against the peace. And so if an Egyptian businessman would go to Tel Aviv and buy an Israeli startup company 3 years ago, 5 years ago, maybe even today, and then they go back to Cairo, their house might be burned down. And if an intellectual from Amman would go to a writer's symposium in Jerusalem and then write about it in some flattering way in a paper in Amman, he may never publish again, because you have all those forces in those societies militating against a deeper peace, a peace not just between governments, but between peoples. You have it from the top down, but you don't have it from the bottom up. None of those forces exist in the Emirates and Bahrain, for sure. They're just not there. So you have people who really would like to see this emerge into a much more a substantive peace, a peace not just between those governments, but a peace between peoples. And we should work hard to ensure that that's the type of peace that we have there, because maybe that could convince some people in Egypt and Jordan, that they've actually wasted a lot of time. They had a peace for 40 years in Egypt's case, more than 40 years. In Jordan's case, more than 25 years we've had peace. And they didn't use it to the benefit of their own people. Well, what if we create such benefits, like economically, doing joint ventures, having Arab partners and Jewish partners invest, could be Israeli technology, placing that technology and working with Arab entrepreneurs to house it in their own countries and to be able to expand that throughout the Arab world and the Muslim world, it could be a game changer. And I think that could affect the current peace that we have with Egypt and Jordan and also expand it elsewhere. We have to make this peace a huge success. And that's on us. And it requires thinking about the peace in a different way. And the good news is the people there want such a peace. They want a mutually beneficial peace, not just something you sign between two governments and then all of a sudden you'll see each other, once every 6 months, but it's cold and you keep their distance. I think there is a desire to make such a peace, and we should do it. And a lot of that onus is going to be on us to try to build such a peace from the ground up and not just from the top down.
You played it's a historic role already, thank God, with the peace, the Abraham Accords, and you'll continue to. Ron, God bless you in every way. It's so good to see you.
Good to see you.
Speaking out for the Jewish people.
Chag Kasher
and Israel.
V'Sameach.
Chag Kasher V'Sameach as well.